Hey everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our first webinar on the Voluntary Framework of Accountability, where we'll be talking about our reports overview. My name is Erica Oriens with the Michigan Center for Student Success, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Jenny Schenker and Katie Girardello, and also our newest colleague, Carl Weckerly, who I'm grateful that they're joining us today. So you'll hear from me, but then you'll also hear from them throughout the webinar as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. The webinar is being recorded, and so if some of your colleagues were not able to join us today, they'll be able to find the recording of the webinar. This is also the first webinar in a series that we'll be hosting throughout this fall. This is the reports overview webinar, but then for the next 4 webinars, we'll really be diving into a lot more detail, looking at VFA data for developmental ed on September 15th, economic stability on September 30th, transfer on October 8th, and overall student success on November 10th. We came up with this series earlier this year because as we were talking with community colleges, the vast majority of community colleges in Michigan report data to the VFA, but the VFA data has a significant amount of data in it, and we wanted to help people understand how to read the VFA reports. We also wanted to, across the state, increase access to and the use of VFA data. And we wanted to increase access to information about benchmarking with your peer institutions. Our final goal of this series is to provide community colleges with a template to use when you're presenting your own college data. So today I have posted these slides on the MCCA website at mcca.org. Click on events, and if you find this event, you should see a PDF slide deck on there. If you're having trouble viewing my screen, you may want to follow along on your own computer. But after this presentation, we'll also be updating the PowerPoint version of the deck. I'll pull out some of the slides related specifically to the MCSS. And then colleges are invited to customize the PowerPoint presentation to meet your own needs on campus. And that will also be true for all 5 of the presentations that we'll be presenting this fall. So look for that on the MCCA website. I recognize many of you, many of your names anyway, and you are frequent attendees of MCSS events, but for those of you who don't know us, the Center for Student Success is part of the Michigan Community College Association. We serve the 28 community colleges in Michigan. We were created in 2011 with a grant from the Kresge Foundation and have been focusing on student success efforts with the community colleges in Michigan ever since. This slide just represents some of the many, if not all, of the current initiatives that we're focused on at the Center for Student Success. As you can see, the VFA is listed on this slide, but really, as you noticed from our series overview, we really use the VFA to focus on all of our projects, and that's really the purpose of this workshop series, is for colleges to think about how they can use the VFA data to connect with all these projects. This is a lovely picture of the staff of the Center for Student Success. And so I'm joined by Jenny and Katie today. Our newest colleague, Precious Miller, is on maternity leave. She had a baby last month, although she will be joining us again next week. She'll be back from her maternity leave, but she's spending time with her little baby boy now. So we're excited for Precious. Before we get started, I also want to thank a few of our colleagues across the state. Erica Bolig, Vladimir Edelman, and Deirdre Sims worked with Jenny and I over the last month or so to review this slide deck and this information, helped us really think through some of these issues, anticipate some of your questions, and identify what might be most valuable to you as you're thinking about using VFA for some of your student success efforts. So thanks to Erica, Vlad, and Deirdre for all of their work and helpful feedback to Jenny and I throughout this process. I mentioned earlier that you can find these slides at the MCCA website under events. If you select Michigan Center for Student Success, you can filter and just see the events from the Michigan Center for Student Success. And then if you click View Past Events, that's where you can find resources from our past events, agendas, handouts, slide decks, all of those materials that we made available during the webinar. You can find that under the past events. I'll also point out that many of you probably received an email from Jenny or Katie or I, or you may have received something from all of us in the last couple of days, encouraging you to register for the Student Success Summit. The Student Success Summit is really the premier event of the Center for Student Success. We usually host it each fall in Lansing, and it's usually on a couple of beautiful fall days. But unfortunately, this year, of course, we will be needing to do that event virtually. And so we've pulled together a really fantastic set of presentations that we will host on September 16th through the 18th and September 23rd through the 25th from just about 3 to 5 p.m. each day. So hopefully you'll be able to fit that into your schedule. Most of those events will be recorded and will be available on the events website after the summit concludes. So please register for that. Some of you may know in the past we've had a limited number of people who can register for those events, but this year we really have an unlimited number, so please share that widely with folks on your campus as well. Okay, so let's talk about how you can participate in the webinar today. So the first thing that we do that we've tried to start doing is asking you to rename yourself. And so if you go to the participant pane, and if you go in your system tray, you should either see a button that says participants, and you should be able to click that. If you find your name and click more, you can rename yourself. It's very helpful if you can include the name of your institution after your name. And so if you have questions, we can identify what institution you're from. Thanks, I see some of you are doing that. We will also use the chat feature. And so again, if you go down to your system tray, and you'll probably need to click on the little 3-button ellipsis for more and then open your chat. You should be able to see some chats in there. And I know that Katie and Jenny will probably be adding links out there that we are talking about, so you can find that in the chat as well. And then finally, if you have a question and you wanna raise your hand, you can raise your hand to speak as well. So that's how we'll do engagement. And then we also have a couple of polls that we're going to share today as well, assuming that the polling will work for me. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about the VFA basics. So I have a disclaimer before we get started here. I'm not an expert on the VFA, and I know many of you that are on the call probably are. So please jump in if there's anything that I've missed or anything that you think is relevant to our conversation today. But for those of you who are on the call, I just want to go over some basics of the voluntary framework of accountability before we get into the data. So the VFA has been around for several years, and it was created by the American Association of Community Colleges. And really its original purpose was to expand the traditional members of student success. So many of you know through the student success movement, We have typically really only looked at full-time, first-time degree-seeking students and tracked them through their graduation. And we really only were concerned if a student graduated from the institution that they started at, so those kind of traditional students. So AACC worked with community colleges across the country to create the voluntary framework of accountability. It expands traditional measures of student success. It includes more students in the cohorts. It looks at a longer time frame to observe those outcomes, and also predicts several metrics that predict short-term and long-term student success as well. Data are reported by individual community colleges, and so are comparable to national and Michigan data as well. So let's just jump in and look at those VFA metrics. So as I mentioned earlier, we would traditionally look at bachelor's or associate degree completion at your home institution, typically after a period of about 3 years at a community college. But the VFA looks at several measures of degree completion, earning a community college baccalaureate. So this is not a bachelor's degree at a university, but the community college baccalaureate. Earning an associate degree, transferring after the receipt of a degree, or not transferring after the receipt of a degree. So in addition to earning those degrees, we can track if students transferred or didn't transfer. We also, in the VFA, look at certificate completion. So if the student earned a certificate, and then if the student earned an award or transferred after they received that certificate or did not. We look at students who didn't receive a degree at all, but did transfer to another institution. And then we look at students who are still enrolled during the 6th academic year that we report. And if the student left with earning greater than or equal to 30 credit hours or less than 30 credit hours, but did not earn a credential and did not transfer. So those are the metrics that are tracked, the 6-year metrics that are tracked in the VFA. Within the last couple of years, VFA has added several other metrics that are typically called the early momentum metrics, or maybe called the early momentum metrics, or KPIs is the other term that is used for these. And so they look at some metrics after 1 year. And they look at credit accumulation. So they look at earning 6, 12, and 15 credits, or 6 and 12 credits, excuse me, in the first term. And then they also look at credit accumulation, earning 15, 24, or 30 credits in the first year. So those first 2 are the first term, the next 3 are the first year. They look at gateway course completion. So if the student passed college level English, college level math, and college level English and math, looking at those students. And then looking at 2 measures of retention and progress. So fall to next term retention, and then the credit success rate. So the extent to which the student was successful in the credits that were attempted after that first year. The other fantastic thing about the VFA is that the data are disaggregated. And while we in higher ed are able to access disaggregated data for various different metrics, depending on the data source, it tends to be pretty inconsistent if we can look at disaggregated data. And so the VFA disaggregates data by gender, the Pell status, if a student was or was not awarded a Pell Grant, their enrollment status in the first term, if the student was college ready or not, disaggregated by age, and then disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So this is a huge opportunity to look at disaggregated data on a variety of different metrics, as I know many of you are looking at equity concerns on your campus. The other great thing about the VFA is that they look at different cohorts of students. And so as I mentioned earlier, one of the wonderful things about the VFA is it doesn't only look at first-time students. And what VFA does is begins with what we call the main cohort. So that would be all students who entered your institution for the first time after high school and are enrolled in credit or developmental education classes in the fall term. So these are all students that show up at your institution this fall. So if we take this fall, for example, the students in the main cohort could include students who have attended another community college or perhaps attended another university, but that we would include everybody who came for the first time at your institution this fall. However, the VFA also looks at two different sub-cohorts of that main cohort. The first one are the first time in college students. So this would be the most similar to what your institution typically reports to IPEDS or to the US Department of Education. And this is probably historically the most common cohort that we see in higher education, which would be the first time in college. So these are the students who show up at your institution in the fall, who have never attended another institution of higher education after graduating from high school. And so they are degree-seeking students, degree or certificate-seeking students, but they've had no prior higher education experience. So what we would typically in higher education have historically reported as the first-time students. And then the other interesting cohort that VFA tracks, and this cohort doesn't have every metric, but they also have an interesting cohort that they call the credential seeking cohort. And these are students that come from the main cohort who after 2 years have completed at least 12 semester credit hours. So we look specifically at those students. And part of the reason for this is, and I'll address this a little bit later as well, but we do know that there are students in community colleges who come to the community college and may enroll as a degree-seeking student, but they're not really seeking a degree. And so this is VFA's way of identifying those students who appear to be seeking a credential, whether that be a certificate or a degree, based on their enrollment behavior, based on their course-taking behavior, in the sense that they've earned at least 12 semester hours by the end of their second year. So that would be a subgroup of that cohort. So I just want to provide you an example of what the numbers look like with these cohorts. So I selected a year, and I think this is fall of 2012 as an example. And there were, across the state of Michigan, among institutions that reported, there were 52,944 students in the main cohort. Of that, 36,000 and change were first time in college, and then 32,000 of those students were credential seeking students. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the numbers that we're looking at in the different cohorts. The VFA provides data, and I will share some today on all of these cohorts. But at the Center for Student Success, we really focus on the main cohort, because even though students may have enrolled at another institution, now that you're at your institution, we encourage colleges to look at the main cohort and track the outcomes of those students, because we think that enrollment and the outcomes of those students are really just as important as the first time in college and the credential seeking students. The other reason that we selected the main cohort, and we talked with Erica and Deirdre and Vlad about this, is, as you'll see later in the presentation, the data are not that different between the cohorts. So don't worry so much about which cohort you choose to look at in your data, because while the outcomes differ slightly, I don't think the differences are not so huge that it should be something that you're terribly concerned about which cohort you choose. So why use the VFA? Why did we choose to use this? Why do colleges, and I see some IR folks on the call, why do we spend so much time reporting this data, and why are we doing this big webinar series about this? Well, because we believe that the VFA really reflects the whole community college mission. The metrics look at both the degree and certificate attainment, but also looks at transfer. And it also looks at some of those early momentum metrics. In working with the Community College Research Center, we also know that research suggests that those early momentum metrics predict longer term success. So we love that VFA, for the same cohort of students that we follow, the research suggests that those early momentum metrics are a good indicator of long-term success for students. The other terrific thing about the VFA is it provides a valuable opportunity to benchmark with national and state peers. There's some benchmarking tools that your IR office has access to, but I think even just benchmarking your institution with national data and with data from all the other community colleges in Michigan really kind of allows you to establish where you might be ahead of your peers or where you may have opportunities to catch up. We also love that the VFA and our colleagues over at VFA, and I think Vaughn is on the call as well, that the data are quite consistent across time. Nothing is worse than when data are reported to an organization and the data definitions change over time, and it really doesn't allow us to track historical trends. And so we really like that, for the most part, the VFA data has been very consistent across time. There are detailed short and long-term outcomes, and the data are disaggregated by essential subgroups, as I said earlier, in many ways, subgroups that we don't get to see in a lot of other data sets. And then finally, the data are reported by your institution. And the reason that that's important is because if you want to work with your IR office to do some additional analysis on these data, perhaps you're wondering if you're really interested in what's happening with your Pell students, but you're also interested in what's happening with Pell students in disaggregating that specifically by race and ethnicity. It's possible to do that with the VFA data, and your IR office should have that data. The last thing I want to mention before we jump into the data is I want to go back to that comment that we made about students who do not intend to earn a degree. One of the things that always plagues us in these student success conversations is we just wonder what percentage of students that come to our institutions don't appear to intend to earn a degree. And so what percentage of our students can we really say they're here to learn a skill, to get a better job, to do something that their employer wanted them to do, or to get some training, but they never intended to earn a degree. So about probably 5 years ago now, we partnered with Peter Barr from the University of Michigan, and Dr. Barr came up with a term for these students, and they are called skills builders. He has a great story about this because Dr. Barr is from California, and before he got his PhD in higher ed, he worked at a water treatment plant in California and was required by his employer to go to a community college and be trained, but he never earned a degree. So he was quite interested in the instance and the frequency of that in community colleges. So he looked at data from selected community colleges in Michigan and identified skills builders who tended to focus on courses in career and technical education. They attended community college for a short period of time. They were very successful in their courses. And then they also experienced increased wages after enrolling, but did not complete a degree or transferred. So a really great definition of what those skills builders are, and kind of putting some language around what we think about those students who are coming to our campus to build their skills. In the data set that he had, he found that skills builders accounted for about 77% of the community college student population. So when we look at the data in Michigan, we could probably estimate, and it can vary by institution, but perhaps 7 on average, but maybe let's say 5 to 15% of students enrolled at our community colleges would be those skills builders, and they're not intending to earn a degree. The interesting part of this study is that over a quarter of the students who appeared to focus on CTE were skills builder students. So a really great opportunity for those of you who work with your occupational programs to think about what the outcomes of those students are and how you might be able to serve those students by awarding a short-term certificate or thinking about the programs that you're offering. So I just wanted to address that before we get into the data. Okay, so let's continue and let's look at some outcomes in Michigan. So what we're doing today is we want to show you Michigan data, but recognizing that these data can be replaced by data at your own institution, but we want to give you an idea of what's in the VFA. So the first thing we want to do is we want to launch a poll. So we're asking you to be active. And if you did download the data, or if you did download the slides from the MCCA website, if you have been resourceful, you will know that you can probably find the answer to these poll questions in the slide deck. But we'd still ask that all of you complete the poll. So you should be seeing a poll, a Zoom poll right now that says what % of students, main cohort students enrolled in fall of 2012 completed a credential. And I see that we've had 10, 11, 12, 13. We've got about over 60% of people have voted. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds to submit your vote. And then we'll close the polling. Don't worry, we have several poll questions in the presentation. And so I'm going to give you 1 more second. Great, I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. And I'm hoping somebody can confirm that I am sharing the results. But if you're seeing what I'm seeing, it looks like the overwhelming response, 70% of respondents said that between 15 and 29% of students completed a credential. Students who enrolled in fall of 2012 can complete a credential. Thank you, Ellie, for telling me you can see the results. So I'm going to stop sharing and let's see. So you were correct. After 6 years, among the students who began in fall of 2012, that 52,944 students, 18.9% of those students earned a credential. And so they earned a bachelor's degree. And remember, that's a bachelor's degree at a community college, an associate degree and didn't transfer, and about the same % earned an associate degree and did transfer. A little over about 1,400 students earned a certificate, and the vast majority of those students did not transfer. Almost a third of students transferred without receiving an award at a community college, but almost half of our students left with 45% of students left without earning a degree or left without transferring, and just about 5% are still enrolled. So excellent job on that first poll. At least on the poll, not necessarily on the student outcomes, but this is information that you would be able to get from your own institution as well. Okay, let's move on to the second poll question. And the question is, what % of students earned in the main cohort earned 6 credit hours in their first term? So I just launched the poll. And the responses are less than 15% of those 52,000 students earned 6 credits in the first term. 15 to 30%, 31 to 60%, or more than 60% of students earned 6 credit hours in the first term. So we've got people voting. We're up to about 72%, 75%. So I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds, and then I will end the poll. Okay. So we have slightly different responses this time. We're seeing some consistency. Over half of respondents thought that about 31 to 60% of students earned 6 credit hours in the first term. Then we're distributed, a third thought 15 to 30%, and then just 3 people thought more than 60%. So I'm going to stop sharing the results and let's see. So this is among students. I'm showing you the different cohorts I wanted to show you this time. And I'm also showing you 3 different cohort years. So among students who started in fall of 2012, students who started in fall of 2016, and students who started in fall of 2017. And so it was kind of a trick question because I wanted to give you, I think I gave you an opportunity to, well, maybe all the answers were in that one that most of you selected. But we are in a range between 45.8% and 55.8%. So we have a 10% range. And I wanted to show you this because in the fall of 2012, in the main cohort, about 45.8% of students earned 6 credits in the first term. If we're just looking at first time in college, slightly more students, 46.5%, so 0.7% difference, earned 6 credits in the first term. So that I wanted to just show you that at least statewide, we're not seeing a huge difference between the main cohort and first time students. But what we are seeing is an improvement. And so we see that we've gone really almost a full 10 percentage point difference in the main cohort in just 5 years between fall of 2012 and fall of 2017. And that's also true for students in the first time in college cohort. In 2012, we were at 46%, and then in 2017, we were at 55%. So we are seeing a pretty significant jump there. Of course, recognizing these historical data in the VFA can be really challenging given the time period that we're talking about here. Fortunately, in fall of 2012, as you'll notice, we've seen a really significant decline in our cohort numbers. We've lost about 10,000 students in the first time in college cohort and close to 15 or 14,000 students in the main cohort. And that, of course, mirrors the declining enrollment at community colleges across the state among post-high school degree-seeking students. And so there's something there that may be part of this solution, but at least it gives you some information about credit accumulation. Okay, let's move on to looking at our metrics related to those gateway courses. And so I'm going to pull up the next poll question here, and I hope you can see the question that asks what percentage of students in that main cohort passed college level English in the first year. And the responses are less than 25%, 25 to 50%, and more than 50%. While you're answering that question, I'm going to ask Jenny if you can jump in and just speak a little bit to why we don't ask questions about what percentage of students were placed into developmental education or past developmental education. Jenny, I don't know if you can unmute yourself and talk about that.
I can, Erica. Thanks for asking. So when we think about developmental education, we often think about placement, we think about college readiness, and the first go-to question is often, well, if you're asking who passed college level English, you're going to ask how many of those students were placed in college level English or passed a developmental education course to get to college level English. What's a lot of research over the past decade nationally has focused on the obstacle presented by those developmental education courses in the sequences that we have set up to ask students to jump through as hoops and obstacles. And so the research has begun focusing on this idea of how many pass college level English in the first year, no matter what. And that takes into account the growing numbers of students who are being placed into co-requisite remediation, which allows students to finish both their developmental and their college level work in one semester. More students who are being placed at college level through placement practices that are changing, related to finding out that many of the placement tests that we use also are not as accurate. The inacuplacer, as it were, are placing students lower than they need to be. And we're finding that more students can pass college level courses right out of the gate or with some co-requisite support. So hopefully that helps.
Great, Jenny, thank you. So we will reveal the poll results, and the 70% of people thought that between 25 and 50% of students passed college level English, which I don't think, let me see, I am now sharing the poll results. And so about 70% of people thought that students passed college level English. And again, I wanted to present to you the data from 2012, 2016, and 2017. We're looking at the middle column here that looks specifically at college level English. And the good news is that in some cases we've exceeded 50%. So some of you were correct, but for students who were first time in college in the fall of 2016 and in fall of 2017, that actually exceeds 50%. But the other really wonderful thing here is how much we've improved in English, passing college level English. Among those students in the fall of 2012, we were at just over a third of students, and now we're over half of students. Close to over half of students are passing college level English in that first time in college cohort. The last poll question that we want to ask is, what percentage of students, hold on, sorry. What percentage of students returned the following fall? And so I'm going to launch our last poll. So what percentage of students in the main cohort returned the following fall? Was it a quarter, between a quarter and a half, three out of four, or more than 3 out of 4 students? I'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. And I will end the polling because we have about a 50-50 split. Some believed it was between 25 and 50%, and the other half believed it was between 50 and 75%. So I'm going to stop sharing those results and let's have a look. And the fall to next term retention has actually been very consistent in Michigan. Just typically hovering right around that 75%, or 3 out of 4 students return the next, oh, I think I did that question wrong. It's the fall to next term retention, sorry. And so that would have probably impacted your answers. But you can see here that we've hovered pretty consistently around, somewhere between 70 and 75, 76% across our cohorts and across all of our several years. But you can also see here that we've improved pretty substantially in the 1-year credit success rate. So the number of credit hours attempted and the number of credit hours earned. Okay, the other thing that I want to just sample for you are the disaggregated outcomes. So I discussed those disaggregated outcomes earlier and what those outcome categories are. But I also wanted to show you what that looked like and what you can get for your own institution. So you can get the disaggregated outcomes by all of the metrics that we've described, but we're just going to look at a couple of metrics in the gateway courses that Jenny just talked about a little bit earlier. So what we've done here is for the VFA main cohort, for the students who started in fall of 2012, we see those, that 43.5% that we saw earlier for the students who started in the fall of 2017. And then you can see here that we have those outcomes disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And you can see where we are observing some pretty significant equity gaps based on race ethnicity among our students. So this is critically important information as you're thinking about how you can address some of those equity gaps at your institution, particularly when it comes to your Dev Ed sequences and your college level, passing college level English and math. We also wanted to remind you that this is also available by age. The reason that we selected these two outcomes, because they do tend to be the areas where we see significant gaps in outcomes based on race ethnicity, and then also based on age. And as you can see here, among all students, about 43.5% pass college level English. The younger the student is, the more likely they are to pass that college level English, and then it declines pretty significantly by age. I really like the age category because you don't get this data in very many other sources. So encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, that's the end of the data presentation that we wanted to show you. And that's really just a sample of all the data that you can get in the VFA. So it's a small sample of what we have, which is exactly why we've decided to have a webinar series talking about these various different topics, because throughout this webinar series, we're going to be able to slice and dice the data in different ways. And I want to give you a little bit of a preview of that. So in our next webinar, we'll focus on VFA for developmental education, and it should be no surprise to you that we will be focusing on the 3 metrics related to the gateway courses, and looking at disaggregating the data as we're looking at college level English and math. And then we'll also be looking at the relationship between successful completion of those gateway outcomes and some of those longer term outcomes as well. At the end of September, we'll be focusing on VFA for economic stability and equity, and this is related to the work that we're doing with the MyBest project, Michigan Building Economic Stability Today, where we're focused in part on connecting students with community resources and public benefits to support their non-academic needs. And this webinar will really focus on those outcomes, and we will be looking a lot at the disaggregated data when we're looking at economic stability. Then later in October, we have our VFA for transfer webinar. And so what we'll be doing is looking at the data that we have from VFA that looks at degree completers and what happens to those students in their transfer patterns after they complete a degree or a certificate. And we'll also be looking at that 31% of students who transferred to another institution without a degree. Again, we'll be disaggregating those data and looking at the relationships between those transfer outcomes and some of those early momentum metrics. And then finally, in our final webinar related to student success, and I know this is not exactly accurate when it comes to student success, but what we really want to do is drill down into those students who actually weren't successful at our institution, that left the institution without earning a degree or a credential and didn't transfer. And I appreciate that VFA has disaggregated those data by looking at students who've left with less than 30 credits and looked at students who left with greater than or equal to 30 credits. So what can you do next? So I would encourage you to invite your peers to the webinar series and ask them to use the link where we will be presenting some of the Michigan and national data. And that may be an opportunity for them your colleagues to see what data are available in the VFA and then what that data looks like nationally. And so if you have been working with your faculty or your Dev Ed faculty or the folks that work on transfer, I would encourage them to register for one of those webinars. If you are a person at an institution who prepares your VFA data, since we've been putting these webinars out there, I would probably expect that you'll get more phone calls for people who want to access your institution's VFA data. If you don't have access to this data at your institution, I would encourage you to contact your IR office and find out how you can get access to this. It's really, as you can see, it's really terrific data. And one of our goals of this webinar series is to make sure more people have access. As I said, after today, I will be downloading the PowerPoint version of the slide deck that you can take and you can modify to meet the needs at your institution. If you wanted to provide your institution with an overview of the VFA, I hope this slide deck would be helpful for you to do that. And then of course, you can always contact me or my colleagues and I at the Center for Student Success with any questions. We have included our email addresses on here with our contact information. And so please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And then there were a few slides throughout the presentation that I referenced various different resources. And so I've included those references here as well if you had any questions about how to access any of that information. So we are ending a little bit earlier than I expected, which is a good thing. But I will pause and see if anybody has any questions. Katie and Jenny, I don't know if anybody's asked anything in the chat or if anybody has raised their hand. We'll give you a couple minutes to type in a question if you have any.
And I do not see any hands raised, but maybe someone is ferociously typing a question. You already answered mine. I was going to ask who has access to this data or how can they get it if they don't. And so you read my mind by answering the question.
Okay. All right, well, I know all of you are excellent typers. I also know it's towards the end of the day, towards the beginning of the semester for some of you. So please reach out to us if you have any other questions. We'd love to see all of you at the rest of the series and looking forward to you using this slide deck and sharing this information on your campus. So with that said, I will go ahead and end the session and look forward to talking to you all later. Yep.
Erica Vaughn just put some information in there about how to reach out to the VFA at AACC. So I wanted to call people's attention to that before you click off.
Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks, Vaughn. Vaughn's an excellent resource on all things VFA. And so he has added in the chat the VFA email address, which is simply vfa@aacc.nche.edu. So great way to end. Best wishes to all of you at the beginning of the semester, and I'll look forward to talking with you again soon. Thanks, Jenny and Katie as well.
Bye.
Have a great afternoon.